This is Maria. She helps us with the kids. That's what my husband said, with his hand on the small of my back, steering me past the most important man at the party as though I were staff. He didn't even slow down. He said it the way you'd mention the caterer, and he kept walking, and the important man gave me a polite, dismissive nod and turned back to his drink. And I stood there in the middle of my own husband's party, in a dress I'd bought specifically for that night, and I understood, in the space of a single sentence, that the man I'd been married to for 4 years was ashamed of me. I didn't correct him. That's the part people can't believe when I tell this story. My husband had just introduced me, his wife, as the hired help, to his boss, in front of a dozen people, and I smiled, and I let it stand, and I walked away toward the bar. Because in the 2 seconds I had to decide, something cold and clear rose up in me, an old instinct I hadn't needed in a while, and it said, "Don't make the scene he's braced for. Let him think it worked. And then, at exactly the right moment, introduce yourself." What my husband didn't know, what he'd somehow never bothered to learn in 4 years of marriage, because he'd decided long ago that my past didn't matter, was that I had met his boss before, years earlier, in a context my husband knew nothing about, and that the important man he was so desperate to impress, the CEO he'd been sucking up to all night, was about to walk over to me on his own, within the hour, and greet me by a name and a title that would turn my husband's entire evening, and, it turned out, his entire strategy for our marriage, to ash. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to earlier that night, before the party, when I was still zipping up that dress and telling myself that tonight would be the night things got better. I'll tell you my name isn't actually Maria. That's just what my husband called me when he was pretending I was the nanny. My name is Elena. I was 38 that year, and the reason his boss was going to recognize me is a story I have to tell you carefully, because it's the whole hinge of the thing, and I want you to feel the trap close the way my husband felt it close. My husband's name was Grant, and he worked in finance, mid-level at a large firm, ambitious in the specific, hungry way of a man who has decided that his life is smaller than he deserves, and that the fix is to climb. When I married him, I found that hunger almost endearing. He wanted so badly to be somebody. I didn't yet understand that a man who needs badly to be somebody will eventually decide that the people around him are either ladders or anchors, and that he'd quietly filed me under anchor. We'd met 4 years earlier. At the time, I was a stay-at-home mother to my son from my first marriage, Diego, who was 6 then. And that, the stay-at-home mother part, was the only version of me that Grant ever really took the trouble to see. He met a woman who made the lunches and did the school run and kept a calm house, and he built his whole idea of me around that, and he never once asked what I'd done before. It didn't occur to him that there was a before, and I, in the soft contentment of those early days, didn't push it. I liked being Diego's mother. I'd earned the quiet. I didn't feel any need to hand Grant my resume. But there was a before, and it mattered. Before Diego, before the school runs, before Grant, I'd spent 11 years in the United States Army. I'd commissioned as an officer out of college and served as a logistics and operations officer, and I'd been good at it. Good enough that I'd left as a major with a record that opened doors. And when I got out, in the years between the Army and Diego and Grant, I hadn't exactly been sitting idle. I'd taken my operations background into the private sector, into a consulting role, high-level work advising large companies on logistics and supply chain strategy. I'd been in rooms with executives. I'd briefed boards. I'd walked into companies that were bleeding money through broken operations and shown them where the blood was coming from. And one of those companies, years before I ever met Grant, had been the very firm where he now worked. I'd done a consulting engagement there, a significant one, and the executive who'd brought me in, who'd sat across from me in a conference room while I laid out exactly how to fix his company's operations, who'd shaken my hand afterward and told me I was one of the sharpest people he'd ever hired, was a rising executive named Richard Cole. The same Richard Cole who was now the CEO of the firm, the same Richard Cole my husband had spent all night trying to impress, the same important man Grant had just breezed past while introducing his own wife as the nanny. Grant had no idea. He didn't know I'd been an army officer. He didn't know I'd been a consultant. He didn't know I'd ever set foot in his company, let alone that I'd once been the outside expert his own CEO had personally brought in and personally praised. He knew none of it, because in 4 years he had never once asked. He'd looked at the woman making Diego's lunches and decided that was the whole story, and he'd been so certain of it that when he needed to explain my presence at his big career-making party, the nanny was the first thing that came to his mouth. Let me take you back to that night, because I want you to understand it wasn't a slip. I've replayed it enough times to know. The party was a big deal for Grant, a firm event at the CEO's own home, the kind of evening where careers get made, where being seen by the right people mattered enormously to a man like my husband. He'd been tense about it for weeks, and in the car on the way there he'd said something that I'd let slide at the time, but that landed differently after. He'd looked at my dress, the one I'd bought, the one I'd felt good in, and he'd said, "You look nice. Just, don't feel like you have to talk shop with these people. They're finance people. It'll go over your head. Just be pleasant. It'll go over your head." I'd smiled and said okay, because I'd learned, in 4 years, that Grant's condescension was easier to absorb than to fight, and because some tired part of me had stopped expecting him to see me. I should have known then what the night was going to be, but I didn't fully understand until his hand was on my back and the word nanny was in the air. Here's what I think happened, in Grant's head, in that moment. He was standing in front of the most important man in his professional life, and he had a wife who, in his estimation, was a pleasant, unglamorous, stay-at-home mother who couldn't talk shop, who'd embarrass him if she opened her mouth in a room full of finance people. And rather than risk it, rather than introduce me as his wife and have to stand there while I, as he imagined it, said something ordinary and diminished him by association, he made a snap calculation. It was safer to file me as staff. Less risk. The nanny doesn't have to be impressive. The nanny can be smiled past. He wasn't just embarrassed by me. He'd decided in real time that I was a liability to be managed. And in that moment, standing there in my nice dress being smiled past by a CEO, I made my own calculation. Because here is the thing about being underestimated for 4 years by a man who never asked about your past. You accumulate a great deal of unspent leverage. Grant thought he knew the full extent of me, and he'd built his whole treatment of me on that belief, which meant that the truth, the real, documented, verifiable truth of who I was a card he didn't know I was holding, and I had just been given the perfect table to play it on. So I didn't correct him. I smiled at his boss. I let Grant steer me past, and I walked to the bar and got a glass of wine, and I waited. Because I knew something Grant didn't. Richard Cole never forgot a person who'd impressed him. It was practically his trademark. He was famous in his industry for it. And I was fairly certain that somewhere in the next hour, at a party in his own home, the CEO was going to look across the room, and something was going to click, and he was going to come find me himself. I want to tell you about the 20 minutes I stood at that bar, because they were some of the strangest of my life. I watched my husband work the room. I watched him laugh too hard at the right people's jokes, watched him angle and position and perform, watched him do the thing he was always doing, which was trying to climb, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not just anger, though there was plenty of that, a cold, clean reservoir of it. I felt a kind of clarity about my whole marriage, laid out in front of me like a briefing map. Because the nanny wasn't an anomaly. It was the truest thing Grant had ever accidentally told me about how he saw me. Every small condescension of the last 4 years. It'll go over your head, just be pleasant, don't talk shop. Resolved, standing at that bar, into a single clear picture. My husband had married a woman he considered his inferior, and he liked it that way, and the only reason our marriage had functioned was that I'd let him believe it. And I decided somewhere in those 20 minutes, sipping wine while my husband climbed, that I was done letting him believe it. Not with a scene, not with a screaming match in a CEO's living room, but by simply, finally, stopping the performance of being smaller than I was. The nanny thing wasn't going to be the insult that made me cry in the car on the way home. It was going to be the moment everything changed. I just had to wait for Richard Cole to look across the room. While I waited, I did something I hadn't let myself do in a long time. I remembered who I used to be. Standing at that bar, invisible, I let my mind go back to the rooms I'd commanded. Not metaphorically, literally commanded. I thought about the young lieutenant I'd been, terrified and determined, learning to give orders to soldiers twice my age. I thought about the operations I'd run, the convoys I'd planned, the nights I'd stayed awake making sure other people's children got home. I thought about the conference room, years later, where I'd stood in front of a skeptical executive team and walked them through exactly how their company was hemorrhaging money, and watched the skepticism turn to respect, and shaken Richard Cole's hand at the end while he told me I was the best hire he'd made all year. I had been that woman. I was still that woman. She hadn't gone anywhere. I just packed her away, folded her up small and put her in a drawer, because the life I'd chosen, the quiet, the mothering, the marriage, hadn't seemed to require her, and because my husband had made it clear, in 100 small ways, that he preferred the folded-up version. And I felt a grief I hadn't expected, standing there. Not grief for the marriage, that grief came later. Grief for myself. For how completely I'd let a capable, accomplished, formidable woman be talked into believing she was ordinary. Nobody had forced me to shrink. That was the hard truth I had to sit with at that bar. Grant had offered me a smaller life, and I had for 4 years accepted it. Because it was comfortable. Because conflict is exhausting. Because it's astonishingly easy to let the people around you set the ceiling on who you're allowed to be. The nanny comment wasn't just Grant's failure. It was the bill coming due on 4 years of my own quiet complicity and my own diminishment, and I was the only one who could stop paying it. That's what steadied me, in the end. Not the anger at Grant, the recognition that I had handed him the pen and let him write me small, and that I could take the pen back any time I chose. And I chose that night. He looked across the room 40 minutes later. I felt it before I saw it. That sense you get when someone's attention lands on you. I turned, and there was the CEO, mid-conversation with a cluster of people, and his eyes had caught on me, and gone slightly narrow, the way a face does when it's searching a memory. I met his gaze and I didn't look away, and I gave him a small, calm smile, the smile of someone who knows exactly who she is. And I watched the memory surface. I watched it click. He excused himself from his group, and he walked across his own living room, past my husband, who watched, I would learn later, with dawning confusion, because why was the CEO walking toward the nanny? And Richard Cole stopped in front of me, and his face broke into a wide, genuine, delighted smile, and he said, loudly enough for the nearby clusters to hear, "Major Vega." My God, Elena Vega. I don't believe it. The room didn't go silent. It was too big a party for that. But the clusters near us quieted, heads turning, because the CEO's delight was the kind of thing people orient toward at a party like that. And out of the corner of my eye I saw my husband go very still. "Richard," I said warmly, shaking his hand. "It's good to see you." "Good to see me. Elena, you turned this company around. You know that? The operations overhaul you did for us. What, 7, 8 years ago? We are still running on the framework you built. I have told that story in a dozen board meetings." The consultant who walked in and found $40 million in waste in 3 weeks. He was beaming, gesturing to the people around us now, pulling them in. This woman is one of the sharpest operational minds I have ever worked with, and I have worked with a lot of them. What are you doing here? How on earth do you know these people? And there it was. The whole party had, in a sense, rotated to face me. The finance people who a man had warned me would find my conversation over their heads were now looking at me with the specific, hungry respect that finance people reserve for someone the CEO has just publicly anointed. And standing at the edge of it, gray-faced, was my husband, who had introduced this woman, Major Vega, the consultant who'd found his CEO $40 million, the sharpest operational mind Richard Cole had ever worked with, as the help. I could have destroyed him right there. I want you to understand that I had, in that instant, complete power to end Grant socially and professionally, in front of everyone who mattered to him. All I had to do was answer Richard's question honestly. How do I know these people? Well, Richard, funny story. I'm married to Grant. You know Grant. He just introduced me to you as his nanny. One sentence. I could see it, the way you see a clear shot. And a large part of me wanted it. I didn't take it. Not out of mercy for Grant. I want to be honest, I wasn't feeling merciful. I didn't take it because the cheap version, the public humiliation, would have made me the story. It would have turned a room full of people's respect for me into gossip about him, and I'd have walked out of that party as the woman in the middle of a scene, instead of the woman Richard Cole couldn't stop praising. I'd learned something in 11 years of operations. You don't win by detonating everything in the moment of maximum emotion. You win by controlling the ground. And I had, without lifting a finger, just taken complete control of the ground. So I answered Richard's question with a warm half-truth. Oh, I know a few people in the industry. Small world. And I let him keep praising me, and I asked him intelligent questions about how the company was doing now, and I talked shop. Real shop, the kind Grant had promised me would go over my head, with the CEO and his circle for a solid 20 minutes, easily, fluently, while my husband stood at the edge of it and watched his wife be the most impressive person in the room he'd been trying all night to conquer. Grant didn't come over. He couldn't. What was he going to do? Walk up and reveal that the woman the CEO was fawning over was the nanny he'd introduced an hour ago? He was trapped by his own lie. He had to stand there and watch, and the watching was worse than anything I could have said. I could feel him behind me, and I did not turn around, not once, for 20 minutes. I let him marinate in it. And I want to describe what those 20 minutes of conversation actually were, because they were the most alive I'd felt in years. Richard pulled me into a real discussion, the company's current supply chain headaches, a distribution problem they'd been wrestling with for months. And I did the thing I do. I listened, I asked 3 or 4 precise questions, and then I told him, roughly, where I thought the problem actually lived, not where they'd been looking. And I watched his face change, watched him turn to a colleague and say, "Write that down." A cluster of finance executives, the people I'd been warned would find me over their heads, leaned in to listen to me, deferring, nodding, one of them pulling out his phone to take notes. I was not performing. I was not straining. I was simply operating at my actual level, the level I'd spent 11 years in uniform and years in consulting earning, the level Grant had spent 4 years insisting didn't exist. And it flowed out of me effortlessly, and the effortlessness was the point. This was not a costume. This was just me, unfolded, doing what I was built to do, in a room my husband had been clawing at all night, and I had conquered by simply being myself. At one point, Richard laughed at something I said, and clapped a hand on my shoulder, and announced to the group, "Do you understand that this woman once saved this company more money than most of you will make in your careers?" Listen to her, and somewhere behind me, I knew, my husband heard it. Every word. The man who'd said it'll go over your head in the car, hearing his CEO command a circle of executives to listen to the wife he'd called the help. When Richard finally moved on to his other guests, with a promise to get my number from someone because he had 3 projects that could use my brain, I set down my wine glass, and I walked calmly to find my husband. He was in a corner, drink in hand, and his face when I reached him was a thing I'll remember forever. Confusion and fury, and a dawning sick understanding, all at war. "You never told me," he said. His voice was low, tight. "You were an officer? A major? You did consulting here? You knew Richard Cole?" Each word came out like an accusation, as though I were the one who'd deceived him. "You never asked, Grant," I said. My voice was perfectly level. "In 4 years, you never once asked what I did before I met you. You decided who I was, and you were so sure that tonight you introduced me to your CEO as the nanny. I let that sit. You didn't lie about who I am. You just never bothered to find out. And then you told everyone anyway." "Elena, we're going to go home now," I said, "because it's your event, and leaving early would look bad. And even after tonight, I'm not interested in humiliating you in front of these people. But understand something. That's not because I couldn't. It's because I chose not to. And I want you to think, on the drive home, about the difference between a woman who can't embarrass you and a woman who chooses not to. You've spent 4 years married to the second kind and treating her like the first. We drove home in silence, and that silence was the beginning of the end of my marriage, though it took a while to fully arrive. Here's the part where I have to tell you that this story isn't really about a party. The party was just the moment the truth became visible. What the party did was force me to finally look, clearly, at a marriage I'd been quietly shrinking myself to fit. And once I'd stood in that room and remembered what it felt like to be seen as my full self, to be Major Vega, and not Maria who helps with the kids, I could not unsee it. I could not go back to being small. In the weeks after the party, I did what I do. I assessed. Calmly, without drama, I took an honest inventory of my marriage, the way I'd once taken inventory of broken companies. And the assessment was brutal in its clarity. The nanny comment wasn't a fluke. It was the logical endpoint of 4 years of small diminishments I'd trained myself not to notice. Grant had chosen me because he thought I was less than him, a soft place to feel superior, a wife who'd never outshine him, never threaten the story where he was the impressive one. My contentment as Diego's mother, which I'd experienced as peace, he'd experienced as confirmation that I was manageable, and the moment there was any risk that I might be more than that, might talk shop, might be impressive in front of the people he cared about, he'd move to erase me, to file me as staff. A marriage like that can't be fixed by the other person finally seeing your resume, because the problem was never that Grant didn't know I was impressive. The problem was that he needed me not to be. I remember the exact moment I knew for certain. It was about 2 weeks after the party, and Grant had been in his strange, recalculating mode, asking me questions about my past with that nervous, belated curiosity. One evening he sat down across from me at the kitchen table, and he had a notepad, an actual notepad, and he said, "So I've been thinking, you know Richard obviously respects you, and you've got all these contacts from the consulting world. I feel like we've been really underutilizing that." Underutilizing. He said it about me, his wife, the way you'd say it about an asset on a balance sheet. He wanted to map out, he said, how we could position my relationships to help his career. He'd made a list. He'd literally made a list of my professional contacts and what each might do for him. I looked at that notepad, and I looked at my husband's earnest, scheming face, and I understood with total clarity that nothing had actually changed. Before the party, I was an anchor to be hidden. After the party, I was a ladder to be climbed, but at no point, not for one single moment, had I become a person he loved and respected for her own sake. The party hadn't corrected his vision. It had just changed which use he had for me. Discovering I was valuable hadn't made him see me as a partner. It had made him see me as a better tool. And I thought about Diego then, oddly, about what it would mean to raise my son in a house where that's what love looked like, where a person was measured by their usefulness, where the woman he called mom had accepted being either hidden or exploited but never simply cherished. I didn't want Diego learning that from watching me. I didn't want him growing up thinking that's what a marriage was, or what a woman was for. That, more than the insult, more than the notepad, more than anything Grant said, was the thing that made the decision final. I could survive being underestimated. I would not model it for my son. I tried, for a while, to see if it could change. To Grant's limited credit, the party rattled him enough that he made some efforts, asked me questions about my past, for the first time, with a kind of nervous, belated curiosity. But I could see what the questions actually were. He wasn't discovering his wife. He was recalculating his asset. Now that he knew I had a valuable network, a history with his CEO, a brain that finance people respected, now I was interesting to him, because now I was useful to him. He started, clumsily, to try to leverage me. Could I maybe mention him to Richard? Could I put in a word? The man who'd introduced me as the nanny now wanted me to be his ladder. That was the thing that actually ended it. Not the insult itself. The insult I might eventually have forgiven. What I couldn't forgive was learning that to Grant, I would only ever be one of two things: an anchor to be hidden, or a ladder to be climbed. Never a partner, never simply his wife, valued for herself, the nanny, or the connection, small enough to feel superior to, or useful enough to exploit. There was no version of me, in his eyes, that was just a person he loved. I called a lawyer. Her name was Priya, and her office was busy and full of files, and she was fast and kind, and she listened to the whole story without interrupting, and when I finished, she set down her pen and said, "Miss Vega, I'll tell you two things. The first is that on paper, this is a straightforward divorce. No hidden assets that we know of, a relatively short marriage. The second thing is more important, and it's not legal advice, it's just true. You already left this marriage the night you stopped introducing yourself as smaller than you are. Everything we do now is just paperwork catching up to a decision you've already made." She was right. I had left at that party. I just hadn't filed yet. I have to tell you about the hardest part, which wasn't Grant at all. It was Diego. Because my son, 10 by then, loved Grant. Imperfect as Grant was, he'd been a present stepfather in the daily ways that matter to a kid. And Diego didn't know or care about parties and CEOs and who introduced whom as what. To Diego, we were a family, and I was about to change that, and no amount of my being right about Grant made that easy. I sat with that weight for a long time. In the end, what I told Diego, carefully, gently, without a single cruel word about Grant, was that sometimes grown-ups who care about each other still can't stay married. That it wasn't his fault and wasn't about him, and that Grant could still be part of his life if they both wanted that. I would not use my son as a weapon in my own vindication. Whatever Grant had done to me, he hadn't done it to Diego, and I refused to make a child pay the emotional bill for an adult's failures. That's a line I've never crossed and never will. The divorce itself was not dramatic. Real life rarely is. It was quiet and fair and, honestly, a relief. But the aftermath is where the real story lives, and it's the part I most want you to hear. Because I took Richard Cole up on his offer. He'd been serious about the 3 projects. After the party, through the industry contact he'd mentioned, he reached out, professionally, entirely appropriately, with no idea he was contacting his employee's soon-to-be ex-wife, a fact I saw no reason to make his business. And I went back to work. Real work. The work I'd set aside for the soft, quiet years of raising Diego. The work my husband had been so sure would go over the heads of the very people who were now paying handsomely for my brain. Within a year, I'd built an independent consulting practice. Within 2, I had more work than I could handle and had brought on associates. I was, by any measure, thriving, using the exact expertise that my husband had found so unimpressive that he'd rather call me the help than admit I was his wife. I want to tell you what it felt like to go back, because it wasn't simple. The first engagement terrified me. I'd been out of the game for years, and I sat in the parking lot before that first client meeting, with my hands shaking on the wheel, absolutely certain I'd lost it, that I'd walk in and have nothing, that the folded-up woman in the drawer had gone stiff and useless from disuse. And then I walked in, and I opened my laptop, and I started asking questions. The questions I'd been asking my whole career, the ones that find the place where the money leaks out. And within 20 minutes I felt it come back, all of it, like a language you think you've forgotten until someone speaks it to you. I wasn't rusty. I was hungry, the way you're hungry for something you didn't realize you'd been starving for. By the end of that meeting, the client's CFO was writing down what I said. I walked back out to my car, and I sat there again, and this time I cried, but it was a completely different kind of crying than the parking lot crying of my marriage. It was the crying of someone who'd just found a piece of herself she thought she'd lost for good. That's the thing nobody tells you about shrinking to fit someone else's comfort. You start to believe the smallness is real. You start to believe that the impressive version of you was a fluke, or a phase, or something you made up. It takes actually stepping back into your own competence to remember that the small version was the lie, not the large one. Grant hadn't just insulted me at a party. He'd spent 4 years slowly convincing me that the nanny was closer to the truth than the major, and the deepest satisfaction of those years afterward wasn't the money or even the respect. It was the private, daily reclaiming of a self I'd almost let a man talk me out of. And here is the small, quiet, perfect irony that I did not engineer and take no credit for. Grant's career at the firm did not flourish. Not because I did anything to him. I never said a word to Richard about him, never lifted a finger against him, and Priya can confirm I stayed scrupulously clean. But a man whose main strategy was climbing, working at a company where his ex-wife was now a valued outside consultant, personally esteemed by the CEO, found the ground beneath his ambitions strangely complicated. He eventually left the firm. I heard about it secondhand and felt almost nothing. Not triumph, just a distant, tired closing of a chapter. I did not gloat. It's the part I'm most proud of, and I want to be clear about why, because it's the whole point. The cheap win was available to me from the first second. I could have burned Grant down in that living room and enjoyed the smell of it. I didn't, and I've never regretted it, because the expensive win was so much better. The expensive win was walking out of that party with a CEO's respect and my dignity intact, building a career that made my ex-husband's estimation of me irrelevant, and raising my son without ever teaching him that the way you handle being disrespected is with cruelty. Living fully, as your whole self, is a far more complete answer to someone who tried to make you small than any public humiliation could ever be. Revenge is loud and brief. A life is quiet and long. Life settled into something good. Diego's doing wonderfully. He and Grant actually stayed in touch for a while, which I supported, because a boy's relationship with a flawed stepfather wasn't mine to sever out of spite. My practice is flourishing. There's a moment with Diego I hold on to. About a year after the divorce, he was working on a school project, one of those "what does your parent do" assignments, and he interviewed me about my work. And as I explained it to him, the consulting, the companies, what I actually did all day, I watched my son's face, and he looked at me with this expression of pure, uncomplicated pride and said, "Mom, you're kind of a big deal." And I laughed, and I said I guessed I was, kind of, but inside something healed that I hadn't known was still broken, because that was the whole thing, wasn't it? For 4 years my son had watched me be introduced as less than I was, watched me fold myself small, and now he was watching me be exactly who I am, and he was proud. That's what I'd been fighting for without fully knowing it. Not to beat Grant, to make sure my son grew up knowing his mother was somebody, so that he'd never call anyone the nanny, and never let anyone make him small either. And every so often, when I'm walking into a boardroom to tell a company full of executives where their millions are leaking out, I think about a man's hand on my back and the word nanny, and I don't feel bitter about it anymore. I feel almost grateful, because that word was the alarm that finally woke me up. I'd been asleep in a marriage that required me to be smaller than I was, and one careless, contemptuous sentence at a party shook me awake, and I have been wide awake ever since. People ask me sometimes whether I regret not correcting Grant on the spot, not claiming my place as his wife in that moment in front of the CEO, and I tell them no, because claiming that I was his wife would have been claiming the smaller title. Richard Cole didn't walk across that room for Grant's wife. He walked across it for Major Vega, the consultant who found him $40 million. The most powerful thing I did that night wasn't correcting my husband. It was letting myself be introduced by someone who actually respected me, as who I really was, while the man who'd tried to erase me stood in a corner and watched. So if there's one thing I'd want you to carry out of my story, it's this. When someone in your life introduces you as less than you are, when they file you under staff, or anchor, or it'll go over your head, when they've decided who you get to be and shrunk you to fit their comfort, pay attention, because they've just told you the truest thing they know about how they see you. But here's the part that matters. Their estimation of you is not a fact. It's just a story they need to be true. And the antidote is not to scream the correction in the moment of maximum drama. The antidote is to quietly, permanently, stop performing the smaller version of yourself, and then to go live so fully as your whole self that their story simply stops applying. Let the people who actually see you introduce you to the world, and let the ones who needed you small stand in the corner and watch who you really are. He called me the nanny, so I let his boss call me by my real name, and that was the whole revenge, and it was more than enough. Thank you for spending this time with me. If Elena's story reached something you've lived through, or someone you love who keeps being introduced as less than they are, I'd be honored if you shared it, because someone out there is standing at the edge of a room right now being made small by a person who never bothered to learn who they really are, and they need to know they're allowed to stop performing that smallness. Leave a comment and tell me, have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought they knew the whole story of you? And if you'd like to hear more stories about quiet strength, hard-won dignity, and the power of simply refusing to be smaller than you are, I hope you'll subscribe and join me here. Take care of yourself, and take care of the people who've truly earned a place in your life.